I took my ex to court over a secret he tried to hide. The moment I walked into that courtroom, I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting to prove that the man I once loved was a complete stranger. My lawyer told me to stick to the facts. But when his lawyer stood up and called me a scorned woman grasping at straws, I did the one thing they never expected. I asked the judge one simple question that made my ex's entire case and his new life crumble into dust.
Hey, story lover. Welcome to the Narrative Hub, Reddit Stories. Believe me, this adventure gets wild, but it's only epic with you. Seriously, you make this possible. Want more stories? Greater adventure? Smash subscribe right now. Smash like. Comment below. Let's go.
But let me back up, because you need to understand how we got here. How a random Tuesday afternoon phone call turned my carefully reconstructed life into a legal battlefield that would expose secrets darker than anything I could have imagined. 3 months earlier, I was sitting in my apartment, finally feeling like myself again. The breakup with Ryan Lewis had been brutal, but I'd survived it. 18 months of silence, 18 months of rebuilding. I'd changed my number, blocked him on everything, and moved across town. The wounds were scarring over nicely. Then my phone rang. The woman on the other end didn't introduce herself right away. Her voice was shaky, uncertain, like she'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but still wasn't sure she should be making the call. "Is this Jennifer Smith? You used to be with Ryan Lewis." My blood went cold. Nobody who knew about Ryan called me anymore. I'd made sure of that. "Who is this?" A long pause. Then, "My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm Ryan's financial advisor. Or I was, until last week when I discovered something that made me quit on the spot." I should have hung up, should have protected the peace I'd fought so hard to build. But something in her voice, that tremor of genuine fear, kept me on the line. "I think you should know the truth." The next 5 minutes destroyed everything I thought I understood about my relationship. Rebecca told me about accounts I'd never heard of, properties purchased in both our names that I'd never signed for, business ventures that listed me as a partner, exposing me to debts and liabilities I knew nothing about. Ryan had been using my identity, my credit, my legal standing as a shield for financial decisions that were now imploding. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the timeline. All of this had happened during our relationship, right under my nose, while I'd been planning our future and trusting him with everything. "There's more," Rebecca said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "He's doing it again, with his new girlfriend, the exact same pattern. And when it all falls apart, she's going to be left holding the bag just like you are now." After I hung up, I sat in the dark for 2 hours, my mind racing through every memory, every conversation. Every time Ryan had asked me to sign something quickly because his printer wasn't working, or his computer had crashed, or he needed it for a deadline. Every time I'd trusted him without question. The rage didn't hit me all at once. It built slowly, methodically, like a storm gathering on the horizon. By the time the sun rose, I knew exactly what I had to do. I hired Patricia Adams, a lawyer with a reputation for taking on cases that other attorneys considered too messy, too complicated, or too personal. When I walked into her office and laid out everything Rebecca had told me, she didn't flinch. "We're going to need documentation," she said crisply, already making notes. "Everything you can find. Emails, texts, bank statements, anything with your signature or his. This isn't just about what he did to you. This is about proving a pattern of fraud." The next 6 weeks became an obsession. I combed through every digital footprint of our relationship. Old email accounts I'd forgotten about, cloud storage backups, screenshots of conversations I'd saved because they'd seemed important at the time, though I couldn't remember why. Every piece of evidence went into Patricia's growing file. But Ryan had been careful. For every document I found, there were 10 more that had been deleted, shredded, or conveniently lost. He'd covered his tracks well, almost too well. That's when Patricia suggested something that made my stomach turn. "We need to contact his current girlfriend. If Rebecca is right and he's doing this again, she might have access to documents that connect the pattern. But Jennifer, I need you to understand something. If we bring her into this, there's no going back. This becomes public, messy. It could get ugly in ways you're not prepared for. The thought of reaching out to the woman who'd replaced me felt like swallowing glass. But the thought of letting Ryan destroy another person's life felt worse. Her name was Michelle Williams, and when I finally worked up the courage to message her, I expected hostility, denial, or silence. Instead, I got 3 words that changed everything. I know already. We met at a coffee shop in a neighborhood where neither of us would run into anyone we knew. Michelle looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She slid a manila folder across the table before I could even sit down. I've been documenting everything for 3 months, she said quietly. Ever since I found out about the offshore accounts, I was trying to figure out if I was crazy or if he was really doing what I thought he was doing. Then Rebecca called me too. Inside the folder was a treasure trove of evidence that made my discoveries look amateurish. Bank transfers, forged signatures on loan applications, email chains where Ryan discussed hiding assets, business contracts that listed Michelle as a guarantor for debts she'd never agreed to assume. It was the same playbook, executed with ruthless precision. But there was something else in that folder, something that made my hands start shaking. A life insurance policy, on me, taken out during our relationship with Ryan as the sole beneficiary. The premium payments were still active, still being deducted from an account I thought had been closed years ago. Michelle watched my face as I processed this. "There's one for me too," she whispered. "Twice the value." The implications hung in the air between us, too horrifying to speak aloud. This wasn't just financial fraud. This was something far darker, far more sinister. This was a man who'd been planning, positioning, preparing for outcomes that required our absence. Patricia nearly dropped her coffee when we brought her the combined evidence. "This changes everything," she said, spreading the documents across her conference table. "This isn't just civil fraud anymore. This is potential criminal activity. We need to move fast before he realizes what we know." Filing the lawsuit felt like detonating a bomb. One moment there was tense silence, the next there was chaos. Ryan's lawyer, a slick corporate type named Douglas Parker, immediately went on the offensive, trying to portray me as a bitter ex-girlfriend fabricating claims for attention and money. The preliminary hearing was set for 8 weeks out. 8 weeks of Ryan's legal team trying to bury us in paperwork, motions to dismiss, and character assassination. They dug into my past, looking for anything they could use. They contacted my employer, my friends, my family, trying to paint me as unstable, vindictive, obsessed. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated how much evidence we actually had, and they didn't know about Michelle. The night before the hearing, Patricia called me at midnight. "I need you to be prepared for something," she said. "Douglas just filed an emergency motion claiming you're making these allegations because you're mentally unstable following your breakup. He's going to try to make this about your emotional state rather than Ryan's actions. They're going to attack you personally, viciously, in that courtroom. I need to know you can handle it." I thought about that life insurance policy, about Michelle sitting at home, probably unable to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would determine whether she'd face the same legal nightmare I was fighting. About Rebecca, who'd lost her job because she'd chosen to do the right thing. "I can handle it," I said. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more intimate, which somehow made it worse. Ryan sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against the table. He looked like a man who'd been backed into a corner and was calculating his escape routes. Douglas opened with exactly the attack Patricia had warned me about. He stood before the judge, a woman in her late 50s named Helen Wright, and painted me as a woman scorned, someone who couldn't accept that the relationship was over, who'd concocted elaborate fantasies to justify her inability to move on. "Your Honor, this case is a waste of the court's time and a transparent attempt at revenge disguised as a legal claim. The plaintiff has no credible evidence, only allegations based on misunderstandings, and the biased testimony of a fired employee with an axe to grind against my client. He went on like that for 10 minutes, his voice dripping with condescension, building a narrative where I was the villain and Ryan was the victim of my delusions. I felt Patricia's hand briefly touch my arm, a silent reminder to stay calm, to trust the process. When Douglas finally finished, Judge Wright turned to Patricia. "Counselor, your response." Patricia stood, and there was something in her posture, a coiled readiness, that made me sit up straighter. This was the moment we'd been preparing for. "Your Honor, opposing counsel's characterization would be compelling if it were based in fact. Unfortunately for my client's ex-partner, the evidence tells a very different story. A story of systematic fraud, identity theft, and financial manipulation spanning multiple victims and multiple years." She began methodically laying out our case, walking the judge through the timeline, the documents, the pattern of behavior. With each piece of evidence, I watched Ryan's confidence erode. His lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently, but Ryan just shook his head, his face growing paler. Then Patricia dropped the first bomb. "Your Honor, we have here a life insurance policy taken out on my client without her knowledge or consent, with premium payments still being deducted from her accounts 3 years after their relationship ended." The courtroom went silent. Even Douglas seemed caught off guard. Judge Wright leaned forward, her expression sharpening. "Is this true, Mr. Parker?" Douglas recovered quickly. "Your Honor, there's a perfectly innocent explanation. Many couples take out life insurance policies during their relationships. My client simply forgot to cancel." "Then he won't mind explaining," Patricia interrupted smoothly. "Why there's a second, identical policy on his current girlfriend, taken out without her knowledge, and why both policies list him as the sole beneficiary while the premiums are paid from accounts in the women's names." The judge's head snapped toward Ryan. "Mr. Lewis, stand up." Ryan rose slowly, his polished facade finally cracking. This was the man I'd loved, the man I'd trusted with everything, and now I was watching him unravel in real time. "Mr. Lewis, did you take out life insurance policies on these women without their express knowledge and consent?" Your Honor, I can explain." "Yes or no, Mr. Lewis?" The pause stretched out, painful in its length. Finally, Ryan's shoulders sagged. "Yes, Your Honor, but it wasn't." "And are the premiums for these policies being paid from accounts that these women believed were closed, or that they had no knowledge of?" Another pause, another reluctant admission. "Yes." The judge's expression went from sharp to glacial. "Mr. Parker, your client's conduct suggests something far more serious than a bitter ex-girlfriend with an overactive imagination. Continue, Counselor Adams." What came next was 3 hours of methodical destruction. Patricia presented document after document showing the scope of Ryan's fraud. Bank transfers that siphoned money from accounts in my name. Forged signatures on loan applications that left me liable for debts I'd never incurred. Business ventures that existed only on paper but had left me with tax liabilities that had destroyed my credit. And then, when Douglas tried to argue that this was all just sloppy record-keeping and misunderstandings, Patricia called Michelle to the stand. Michelle walked to the witness box with quiet determination. She looked directly at Ryan as she was sworn in, and I saw him flinch. Patricia's questioning was gentle but thorough. Michelle described how Ryan had asked her to sign documents for their future, how he'd told her the offshore accounts were for tax purposes, how she discovered the discrepancies purely by accident when a bank officer had called to verify a large transfer. "And when you confronted Mr. Lewis about these accounts, what did he say?" Patricia asked. Michelle's voice remained steady, but I could hear the anger beneath it. "He told me I was being paranoid, that I was acting like his ex, that if I loved him, I'd trust him." "Did he mention that his ex was currently suing him for the exact same behavior?" "No, he told me she was unstable and making up lies because she couldn't move on." The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Wright was taking notes, her pen moving rapidly across her legal pad. But Douglas wasn't done fighting. When it was his turn to cross-examine, He came out swinging, trying to suggest that Michelle and I had colluded, that we'd fabricated evidence out of shared jealousy. That's when Michelle said something that made my breath catch. "Mr. Parker, I have no reason to lie. In fact, I have every reason to keep quiet. You see, 3 weeks ago, Ryan proposed to me. I said yes. The wedding is supposed to be next month. Or it was, until I found out he'd taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on me without my knowledge, and I discovered I was legally responsible for over $500,000 in debts I never agreed to assume." She pulled off her engagement ring and set it on the witness stand. "I'm not here out of jealousy. I'm here because I realized that if I married him, I wouldn't just be signing up for a lifetime of fraud. I'd be signing my own death certificate." The courtroom erupted. Douglas was on his feet, objecting, claiming the statement was inflammatory and prejudicial. Judge Wright banged her gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. The mask had fully fallen away. During the break, I stood in the courthouse bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to process what was happening. This had gone so far beyond what I'd imagined when I first filed the lawsuit. This wasn't just about getting my money back or clearing my credit. This was about stopping a predator. Patricia found me there. "The judge wants to move to closing arguments after the break. Jennifer, I think we're going to win this, but I need to prepare you for something. Judge Wright is likely going to refer this case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. This is going to get bigger before it's over." When we reconvened, Douglas made one final attempt to salvage his client's case. He argued procedural technicalities, claimed that even if the evidence was real, it didn't rise to the level of intentional fraud, suggested that this was all a result of poor communication and Ryan's admittedly lax approach to financial organization. It was a desperate performance, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Then it was Patricia's turn. She stood, walked to the center of the room, and spoke directly to the judge with a quiet intensity that commanded attention. "Your Honor, the defense would have you believe this case is about misunderstandings and paperwork errors. But the evidence tells a different story. It tells the story of a man who has systematically exploited the trust of the women in his life, using their identities and their legal standing as shields for his own financial misconduct. This isn't accidental. This is calculated. This is predatory." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The defense called my client a scorned woman grasping at straws. But the only thing my client is grasping for is justice. Justice for the credit that was destroyed while she trusted the wrong person. Justice for the debts she's liable for that she never incurred. Justice for the future that was stolen from her while someone she loved was positioning her as a financial scapegoat." Patricia turned to look at Ryan, and I followed her gaze. He was staring at the table, unable or unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. "And perhaps most importantly, Your Honor, justice for the next victim. Because make no mistake, if Mr. Lewis faces no consequences for these actions, there will be a next victim, and a victim after that. This pattern doesn't stop on its own." Judge Wright called for a 30-minute recess to review the evidence and prepare her ruling. Those 30 minutes felt like hours. I sat in the hallway with Patricia and Michelle, none of us speaking, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what came next. When we were called back in, the judge's expression was grave. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, and I'm prepared to issue my preliminary ruling. Mr. Lewis, stand up." Ryan rose on shaky legs. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been regret or might have been fear of consequences. It was hard to tell, and I found I didn't particularly care. "Mr. Lewis, the evidence presented here today is deeply troubling. What you've done goes beyond civil fraud. You've systematically exploited multiple individuals, using their trust and their legal identities for your own financial benefit. You've created liabilities that could have destroyed their financial futures. And perhaps most disturbingly, you've shown a pattern of behavior that suggests you viewed these women not as partners, but as assets to be leveraged and discarded." She paused, her voice taking on a harder edge. "I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. You are hereby ordered to pay full restitution for all debts, liabilities, and credit damage incurred by Ms. Smith as a result of your actions. Additionally, I'm ordering you to provide a full accounting of all financial instruments, accounts, and policies that bear her name or were taken out using her information. Ryan's lawyer started to object, but Judge Wright held up her hand. I'm not finished. I'm also issuing a restraining order preventing you from contacting Ms. Smith or Ms. Williams outside of legal proceedings. And I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation into potential identity theft, fraud, and forgery charges. The gavel came down with a sound like a thunderclap. This court is adjourned. In the hallway afterward, I stood with Michelle and Patricia, still processing what had just happened. We'd won. The judge had seen through every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to paint me as the problem rather than the victim. But the victory felt strange, hollow in a way I hadn't expected, because winning meant confronting the full scope of what had been done to me. Winning meant accepting that the relationship I'd mourned for 18 months had been built on a foundation of calculated exploitation. Winning meant understanding that I'd been a mark, not a partner. Michelle touched my arm. What happens now? Patricia answered before I could. Now we wait for the DA's investigation. They'll want to talk to both of you extensively. And Jennifer, there's something else you should know. When I started digging into Ryan's financial history, I found evidence suggesting you and Michelle might not be the only victims. There could be others going back years. The implications of that settled over us like a weight. How many others? How many women had trusted him, loved him, and been left to deal with the wreckage of his schemes? Over the next few weeks, the case exploded beyond the confines of that courtroom. The district attorney did open a criminal investigation. They found 3 other women who'd experienced similar patterns with Ryan. Financial accounts opened in their names. Life insurance policies they'd never consented to. Debts they'd been left holding. The media picked up the story, fascinated by the angle of women banding together to expose a serial fraudster who'd hidden behind the facade of romantic relationships. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, victims advocates, other women who wondered if they'd been targeted too. Through it all, Ryan maintained his innocence publicly, claiming that everything was a misunderstanding, that we were all conspiring against him out of jealousy. But privately, according to his lawyer's communications with Patricia, he was desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal to avoid prison time. 4 months after that first court hearing, Ryan Lewis pleaded guilty to multiple counts of identity theft, fraud, and forgery. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all his victims. The life insurance policies were canceled. The debts were erased from our credit reports. The accounts were closed and audited. On paper, we'd won completely. But standing outside the courthouse after his sentencing, watching him be led away in handcuffs, I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. I felt betrayed in ways that would take years to fully process. I felt grateful for Rebecca's courage in making that phone call and for Michelle's willingness to trust a stranger with her own nightmare story. Most of all, I felt the weight of a question I'd been avoiding since this whole ordeal began. How had I missed it? How had I loved someone capable of this and never seen the warning signs? Patricia, standing beside me, seemed to read my thoughts. "You couldn't have known," she said quietly. "That's how people like him operate. They're charming. They're convincing. They make you feel like you're the problem for questioning them. It's not your fault that you trusted someone you loved." Maybe she was right. Maybe it would take time before I could believe that fully. But standing there, with Michelle on my other side and the courthouse doors closing behind us, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I'd asked the judge the one question that Ryan couldn't answer, couldn't deflect, couldn't charm his way around. Is this true? And in that moment, with no escape route left, he'd been forced to speak the only words that mattered. Yes. That single admission had unraveled everything. His carefully constructed lies, his manipulation, his entire false identity as the wronged party. One question, 2 letters, and the truth had finally, definitively won. 6 months later, I'm rebuilding. My credit is recovering. The therapy is helping. I've reconnected with friends I'd isolated myself from during the relationship, recognizing now that isolation had been part of his strategy. I've learned to trust my instincts again, to ask questions without apologizing, to believe myself when something feels wrong. Michelle and I have coffee sometimes. We don't talk about Ryan much anymore. We talk about our jobs, our families, our hopes for futures that no longer include looking over our shoulders. We talk about how we're going to use this experience, not let it use us. Rebecca got a new job at a firm that values her integrity. She sends me a text every few weeks, just checking in, making sure I'm okay. The other victims from Ryan's past have each dealt with their own healing processes. Some wanted to stay in touch, finding strength in shared experience. Others needed distance, needed to close that chapter completely. I respect both approaches. We all survived the same predator, but we're all surviving the aftermath differently. As for that simple question I asked the judge, the one that Douglas called inflammatory and prejudicial, it was this. Your Honor, if Mr. Lewis's actions toward me were truly innocent misunderstandings as his counsel claims, why would he be engaged in identical behavior with his current girlfriend? That question cut through every defense, every excuse, every attempt to reframe the narrative, because the pattern was undeniable, and patterns don't lie. Sometimes at night, I still wake up angry at Ryan for what he did, angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, angry at a system that allowed him to victimize multiple women before facing consequences. But more and more, I wake up feeling something else. Relief, because it's over, because the truth came out, because I fought back instead of staying silent. And determination, because there are other women out there, right now, who are living with secrets their partners are keeping, who are signing documents they don't understand, who are trusting people who are positioning them as scapegoats for financial crimes they don't even know are happening. This story isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what happens when we stop accepting "trust me" as an answer, when we start asking questions, when we stop letting shame and fear keep us silent about financial abuse that hides behind the word love. The man I took to court over a secret he tried to hide taught me something valuable, though not in the way he intended. He taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop loving someone who's using that love as a weapon. He taught me that healing isn't linear, that justice isn't always satisfying, and that sometimes winning feels more like surviving. But most importantly, he taught me that when someone tells you who they are through their actions, believe them the first time. And if you missed the signs the first time, it's never too late to open your eyes and fight for the truth. That's how I ended up in that courtroom, asking one simple question that changed everything. And that's how I got my life back,